Hello, everyone. We're just going to give everyone another minute or two here to join, and then we'll start promptly. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. My name is Nick Belenke, and I'm the head of merchant partnerships here at Cardinal Commerce. Thanks for joining us today. Let me do a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the webinar, then I'd like you to submit those in the Q&A box, and we're going to handle those at the end of the presentation. You've joined us today for an inside look industry performance using 3D Secure. And for my first official action, what I'd really like to do is introduce my colleague here, Paul Harrison. He's the head of sales productivity and business development, and he's going to take over the conversation right from here.
Thanks very much, Nick, and good morning. How are you?
I'm doing well. Doing well. Thank you for joining me.
Well, it's good to catch up with you since our last webinar, which I think was at the end of September.
Right.
A very interesting topic where we discussed with merchants how they can navigate through the holiday season and address the onslaught of fraud. So I think a lot of interesting discussion during that last webinar and questions that came out of it. Today's session, I think, is going to be particularly interesting to merchants because we're going to discuss how 3D Secure can help merchants improve their authorization lift, and that's obviously of key interest to merchants. But not only that, how they might be able to reduce fraud at the same time, as well as those overhead expenses such as chargeback and manual reviews. But the proof is really in the pudding, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we're going to share results of analysis that Cardinal has carried out, and those results will highlight how 3D Secure does indeed help merchants improve their authorization rate. Moreover, we're going to break these results down by industry verticals. So if you're a merchant listening in today, it might be an indication as to how you might be able to improve your business. Perhaps there's an industry vertical that you fall within. But before we talk about the results, perhaps, Nick, you might be able to just briefly walk us through the theory of how 3D Secure does indeed help improve authorization rates, but also reducing fraud and those other overhead expenses.
Yeah, I'm excited to get in all the data, but I think it's a good idea to go over this first. So let's talk about each of the three major headings that you sort of brought up here in the previous discussion. So let's start with authentication and really how it complements authorization. So think of authentication first, a couple of different reasons. So authentication first from the standpoint of authentication happens before authorization, so authentication first in that. And that's from that standpoint. But also, here at Cardinal, we think of authentication first because it's what we focus on and it's what we do. So authentication occurs before authorization, and it passes information over to the issuer that they wouldn't normally have access to during the authorization process. In fact, the authorization is, think of it as a relatively narrow pipe of data. There's not a great deal of information sent along other than information about the card and the name and expiration date, things like that. So authentication gives us a whole parallel path where we can send additional data, and we're at the point where we're sending north of 100 data points potentially with EMV3DS to the issuer that they can decision on, build their algorithms around, create a fraud reduction strategy based on that data. And that rich data set doesn't rely on the authorization pipe. It happens in parallel. In fact, it happens first. So think of it as an opportunity for the issuer to weigh in on the transaction that they just did not have before. They can give the merchant an understanding of whether or not the issuer is going to look at that data, compare it to that consumer's behavior, and if it matches well and they believe it's a low-risk transaction, they'll pass that information on to the merchant. And later on in a moment here, we'll talk about how the merchant can use that. So, and beyond helping the merchant, when the merchant passes that authentication response back over to the issuer through authorization, that issuer actually can make a better decision themselves, and that's where we get this concept, the terminology around authorization lift. Yeah.
So it's really giving the issuers that broader perspective that they may not have had in the absence of these data elements coming through the authentication pipeline. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, and you got to remember that authorization comes from, it's a technology set that was developed decades and decades ago, and it was it's adapted for the online space, but authentication ahead of authorization is born in the online space, and it gives us basically unlimited number of data points that we can share with issuers, where that's just not possible in authorization. So it's like giving them a three-dimensional view.
Sure. Okay. Very interesting.
So, all right. Well, moving on from that, we'll go into a lot of detail about the numbers. I'm excited to see the graphs that you have prepared, Paul.
Yeah.
And we've got a couple more topics got a couple more topics that are really important when we talk about the value 3D Secure brings. So we talked about authorization lift at a very high level, and I started to touch on this idea as it relates to manual review. So let's discuss that a little bit more. So whenever a merchant is faced with a transaction that looks risky, or really all the transactions that flow, they have the opportunity to look at the ones that they believe might present some sort of fraud risk to them, and they're possibly going to take those transactions and take a look at them, right? They're going to look at the transactions and say, does it match the type of sales that we normally have on our site? Does it match what we expect consumers to buy? Does it match my business style? Is this what we expect this consumer to do? We don't know much about the consumer as a merchant, but we know a heck of a lot about our own business, and we know how our business works. And so one of the ways that we can apply this knowledge is through a review process, and it's in the industry it's generally known as manual review. So if a merchant decides to manually review transactions, they're either going to put the transaction on hold until they can properly review it, or they even fulfill the order sometimes and then review it afterwards. If you're going to put a transaction on hold, you can imagine it's going to negatively impact the consumer experience. And if they review it after the fact and then they decline the transaction, it's going to affect the consumer's views of the merchant site. And so here's where authentication is going to help. You're going to look at that authentication response as a merchant, and you're going to be able to make a better decision whether or not manual review makes sense, whether or not a review makes sense at all outside of your more basic fraud tools. So it's less likely that you're going to need a manual review if you know that your transaction was already authenticated. And there's a lot of benefits to that. You're going to save time and money because you're not going to do those manual reviews, and then you lose the opportunity to falsely decline a transaction. If you're passing a transaction on that the issuer has given you high confidence in, you're in great shape, and you don't have to risk declining or insulting a consumer.
So again, it's although for a different purpose, here it's how the merchant can leverage those data elements. and give them a much broader perspective about the transaction.
Yeah,
and
so
more confidence.
yeah, it's a good clarification. And what I would say is, what the merchant's really receiving from the issuer is an authentication response. They're going to find out what the issuer thinks, and it's relatively straightforward. It's a sort of yes or no, thumbs up, thumbs down on the transaction. We're sending a great deal of detailed data that the merchant already had access to, but that the issuer never had access to. So now, adding to all that merchant data, now we have the issuer's response, which is really information about what the issuer thinks about the consumer's behavior. You marry those together, you're going to get better performance.
Yeah.
And so what are we trying to avoid, I guess, is also an important point here. If we move on to what 3D Secure was designed to address in the first place,
Originally,
is reduction of chargebacks. And so chargebacks, if you're new, obviously if you're new to our webinar series, so chargebacks are a demand, by a credit or debit acquirer for the merchant to make good on a disputed transaction. So they're caused by a lot of different things. We're talking about fraud today. I mean, that's our focus. Focus is on fraud, but chargebacks can be brought upon from the quality of goods or delivery issues, or really a wide variety of reason codes that can be brought on by the consumer as it relates to the transaction. So our focus, of course, is on fraud. So how are we going to reduce chargebacks related to fraud with 3D Secure? So what we're doing there, what we're allowing the issuer to do is take a look at the transactions and give a hint or feedback to the merchant. So before you approve a transaction that isn't authenticated by the issuing bank, you can really look deeply at that transaction and decide if you want to move it forward. We're going to see some data later about how the 3D Secure application actually reduces fraud from the ecosystem by letting the issuers take a look at the transactions in advance, and that's got enormous savings. So of course we're going to save some of the fees, like for example the chargeback fees. But if you're in physical goods, you're going to actually save the goods that you'll be sending out, the shipping cost, the profit associated with that, and then what we can't forget, and this is often sort of overlooked, is there's a lot of overhead associated with chargeback that has really nothing to do with the direct cost of the chargeback itself. It takes time and money and energy and a team to represent chargebacks, and so all of those are not necessary, or they're removed from the system when the chargeback disappears.
Yeah,
right?
those soft costs that are more difficult to quantify but are real nonetheless.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose it's by, let's say, leveraging 3D Secure, it's an opportunity for merchants to be able to divert some of those resources that, let's say, are being used for handling manual reviews to other areas of the business that might be more productive.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. But we can't stress enough that really the focus today is authorization lift. Isn't that correct?
That's right. Let's get back to it.
And why is it such a priority? Well, I suppose if we think about merchants, that's usually the key nut that they're trying to solve. It's becoming more and more of an issue for merchants. How can they convert more good orders? And I've got to believe that it's particularly challenging for, let's say, an omni-channel merchant it's a hard pill for them to swallow, because here's a business that is conducting both in the online world and in the card-present world, and they've got an ability to easily compare the authorization rates for their e-commerce traffic and their card-present traffic. And invariably, they're going to see that the card-not-present authorization rates are lower, and often considerably lower than those for the card-present business.
So that authorization gap between the card-present and card-not-present industries is a major topic, and this is that's the gap that we're really trying to address here. We're looking at that difference between point of sale and online, and saying we can make a difference here.
Yeah, and there's a lot of data out there, but as a kind of a general stroke statement, it could be 15 percentage point difference between car not present and car present. So that's what we're trying to solve for. So now, before we actually talk about the results, I think I'd like to share some information as to how we actually calculated this analysis. So in essence, the analysis that Cardinal carried out was based on 12 months of Visa transactions, and those transactions included settlements and disputed issuer fraud. And we analyzed these broken down by industry verticals according to different MCC codes. And so for each industry vertical, we chose a selection of key merchants located in different geographical regions. So that's important to stress, that the performance the outcome of this analysis doesn't suggest that there was any sort of a bias based on the performance of just one or two merchants or in one or two countries. This was very much a global analysis of key merchants in a given industry vertical. Because ultimately, the goal here was to be able to share a fair representation of the performance of 3D Secure and the impact that it had on authorization rates. And I think it's important to note that, of course, Cardinal will be continuing to update this information on an ongoing basis as the ecosystem evolves. We want to make sure that we're always able to share fresh data. And of course, we're always evaluating other potential industry verticals to add to the analysis. So let's quickly run through our findings, and then perhaps when we get to the end, we can discuss in more detail. How does that sound?
It sounds great. I mean, I like all this build-up, Paul, and you've created a lot of excitement. I can't wait to see the first data to come across.
I'm even more excited than you are.
Okay, great.
Okay, so this is the first segment, the jewelry industry. So the merchants in this group enjoyed a 2% authorization rate lift as a result of using 3D Secure.
So are you saying that it's 2% higher than they would have had if they didn't authenticate the transactions?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Yes. And similarly, the department store merchants and public transportation industry merchants, the next two segments, they both enjoyed a 3% authorization lift.
Okay, so it's going up. That's good.
It's going up.
I feel like you set it up this way, Paul.
Oh, there's a bit of a trend, but hang on. There's more. Entertainment and ticketing, a 4% growth. So,
Okay.
If there's a merchant listening in and they happen to be in the entertainment or ticketing industry, not using 3D Secure today, they'll know what their authorization rates are for their business. Is there an opportunity for them to increase this by using 3D Secure? And I think if you were showing here 4 percentage point increase, just as a rule of thumb, 1 percentage point increase if you've got $100 million revenue, whether it's a monthly or an annual revenue number of $100 million, 1%, that's $100,000 on the top line.
That's a lot of revenue.
It's a lot of revenue. Or if you happen to be bigger, a $1 billion company, well then that's $1 million. So that's revenue that you're not otherwise seeing today. And it's revenue that potentially some of your competitors are seeing. So
it's a good point because when we speak to fraud managers, a lot of times this is not one of the KPIs that they are thinking of when they're thinking about their cost, but they're not thinking about how implementing a fraud tool might affect the revenue positively.
Yeah, absolutely. So the clothing and footwear industry enjoyed a 4.5% increase in authorization rates.
Well,
it only gets better, Nick. It only gets better.
You're closing the gap here.
So the sporting goods industry also a 4.5% increase, but that leads us to the luxury goods segments that enjoyed a 5% increase in authorization rates. So think of that, 5 percentage points increase in revenue on the top line. There's no doubt that the upper management of any of these organizations would be very eager to know how they could increase their business.
That's right.
By 5 percentage points.
I'm assuming you have a culmination here, a crescendo. There's got to be one more data element.
I think
for you to
we
share,
can
Paul.
still peak.
Wow.
We can still
okay,
peak.
I'm excited.
Okay, so hold on. Okay, here we go. Computer and software industry, 7 percentage point increase in authorization rates. I mean, that's quite impressive. So again, this is an indication of how 3D Secure has helped these key merchants within these industry verticals. So for people listening in, if they fall within these segments, perhaps they might be able to enjoy a similar type of authorization lift.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I think it's my turn here to jump in and do our legal disclaimer, of course. So first of all, we have lots of merchants that are part of these industry studies. Their data is included here. Those, of course, individual merchants, your performance can vary within those groups. I think this is a really good benchmark to help you know what direction things are going for your industry. But we here at Cardinal offer the opportunity for you to receive more information, more detailed information about maybe how you're performing today. Maybe you don't have the ability to see these types of metrics within your department easily. We can clue you into what your authorization rates are on VisaNet, and then we can also produce a report not too dissimilar from these authorization lift reports for your organization. Let you know what it's possible, what your gap is, what the room for improvement is, and then after implementing 3D Secure, we can also help you track and figure out what the metrics are and what your lift is, because you'll want to continue the justification of using 3D Secure moving forward as well.
Yeah, and that I think can be of real value to merchants, and we can break this down by region. So if it's a merchant operating in different regions globally, we can break this analysis down by region, or indeed by the issuing banks that they use. So there's a number of ways that we can look at the analysis so that we can really make sure that a go-forward plan to optimize the authorization rates is in place. Yeah,
and I think now is a good time to say, go back to sort of talk about the study itself and say, remind everyone, this is a study on VisaNet data, and it's something that we have access to as a Visa company. But what's also interesting is if you go, it's not just this isn't just a phenomenon that relates to Visa. This is a phenomenon that relates to authentication ahead of authorization. So let's look at a couple of other networks that are doing the same thing and seeing similar performance.
Yeah.
Okay, so MasterCard also has a report where they have the aggregate. Now they haven't broken down by industry vertical, but they released an overall approval increase of 6%. When I say approval increase, they're using the same type of metrics that we are, and you have to look at the approval rate of transactions that do use 3D Secure and the approval rate of transactions that do not use 3D Secure. So when compared, you're looking at a 6 percentage point increase for MasterCard. Discover, again, very similarly, 8% lift across all of their industries, all of their merchant base. And, this is sort of the foreshadowing of, and obviously we talked about this a little bit before, but in MasterCard survey, they didn't stop at authorization lift. They also took a look at how fraud is affected by using 3D Secure. The removal of fraud from the ecosystem was the point. It was the reason that 3D Secure was designed in the first place, and MasterCard saw an 8 basis point reduction in fraud. So I think that's a kind of a good segue into talking a little bit more in more detail about the fraud.
Absolutely, but just to stress that that authorization rate increase cited by both Discover and MasterCard on a global basis and significant, and the numbers that we had shown for the VisaNet data for those industry verticals we're very much in line. So
that's right.
it's credible. I suppose that's the bottom line. But yeah, interesting point. Merchants, they could be forgiven for thinking that reducing fraud and increasing authorization rates is a balancing act. Indeed it is, but it can happen, and the results that we have here show that it does happen. So while today's focus is really on the authorization rate optimization, it's important to note that these same merchants within these industry verticals also enjoyed a reduction in fraud at the same time. And that ranges from the jewelry industry at a 2 basis point reduction to right through to the sporting goods segment of over 120 basis point reduction. So not insignificant at all. It's very much potentially a win-win if the 3D Secure strategy is implemented in a correct way.
Yeah, that's right, Paul. So I think, a couple of things here. So first of all, reminder. So we just want to make sure that if you have questions, you are submitting them in the questions panel. And I think the question, you get around to this point of this presentation, I think the question that people have on their mind is, okay, so how are you achieving these results? Like where are they really coming from? Why is 3D Secure able to improve authorization rates and reduce fraud? And what's the underlying technology that's in place in order to support that? So I'd like to just take a moment to introduce this concept of the Cardinal Network. And Cardinal serves both merchants and issuers in their needs for 3D Secure. And in particularly in certain regions, we are very, very much the primary provider of 3D Secure for the merchant side or the issuer side or both. And so in improving merchants' access to 3D Secure, we allow more merchants to participate in the service. In upgrading issuer access control servers, ACS systems for 3D Secure, that's a risk-based 3D Secure where they can consume these additional data elements, that they can consume EMV 3DS. We improve their ability to have a risk-based response and respond to the merchant with an authentication response that's useful to them. And we can displace some of the older technologies that were relying on things like usernames and passwords for authentication, or even just relying on the network to stand in and not really do a risk-based analysis at all. And so this change in the network that we're helping to support is helping to also change the way that we look at 3D Secure. Instead of just discussing fraud reduction, we're also discussing authorization lift as a result of that.
Yeah, so interesting. That risk-based analysis, it's really real time, right? It's happening behind the scenes, and in a market such as the U.S., the cardholder is not going to be aware of that the majority of times.
Yeah,
right?
That's quite common in the North American marketplace. Often this risk-based analysis is happening and consumers totally unaware. They have no idea. In fact, some of the risk-based analysis occurs so quickly that they're not even aware that authentication is happening.
Okay, interesting. So I suppose it is important to remind customers that, as you had said at the beginning of the webinar, Nick, that authentication does occur before authorization, and it's the means by which that information can be channeled through to the authorization decision-making process. And in order for the authentication to yield the results that we've just reviewed during this session, it must be done so in a collaborative way, right?
Yeah.
So indeed, collaboration really is the key here. And as Nick had mentioned, that's where Cardinal facilitates this in the most effective way via the Cardinal Network. In other words, the ability to be able to have both the issuing bank and the merchant sharing data. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, that provides the confidence for more transactions to be authorized. I mean, that's the bottom line message, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
So I think, you know, I appreciate you, Paul. I appreciate you going into the detail on covering off on all that data that you've prepared for us. I like that. I think it's a good opportunity for us to look at 3D Secure in a way that we don't normally look at it, because we almost always talk about just fraud or just manual review. We discuss those points. We discuss the reduction in fraud and the chargebacks and chargeback overhead.
Yeah.
We discuss reduction in manual review and false declines and how those can have operational impacts for merchants. But what we really, I think, today's focus on authorization lift will help folks think about 3D Secure in a different way, and think about the business KPIs that you want to measure and track related to 3D Secure in a different way as well.
Right. And also to keep in mind that that whole consumer experience is quite different than in the past.
Yeah, this isn't 3D Secure from 20 years ago.
No,
right?
No.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your attention. I want to bring your last bit of attention here to some information here on our website. If you look at CardinalCommerce.com under resources, these industry benchmark reports are available. If you see the link below, those industry benchmark reports are detailed, and they give you access to an understanding of what, for each industry, what the average authorization rate is, the effective 3D Secure, the authorization rate for 3D Secure transactions versus non-3D Secure transactions, as well as detail, including an annual readout on what the fraud trends are for over the course of the year that was reported for that industry. So there's a lot more detail we didn't have a chance to cover here today.
But also important to stress that, as we have mentioned, that's being updated all the time as we gain more information from the marketplace.
Yeah, perfect. So I think it's time to turn our attention to some questions. I know we've been receiving questions. If you have a question, now's the time. Now's your chance to enter it. So hopefully you can get that put in place before
only a few more minutes
before we start answering. I know we have a lot of questions about how the actual studies were done. I know, Paul, you went over that a little bit. I think I think you'll like looking at the industry benchmark reports. There's some information about how the studies were performed in more detail there. But to sort of recap, we took VisaNet data for 12 months. We separated that data into industry verticals, and we measured transactions, essentially comparing two groups of transactions, those that have authentication and those that do not have authentication within those groups, and we compared the performance of those two groups to one to the other, and that resulted in the authorization lift data as well as the fraud data.
Yeah. And I think maybe just to add to that, obviously we, due to privacy reasons, we're quite limited in terms of information that we can share about the methodology, but there's no doubt that the higher the adoption rate, the more the better performance that the merchant is going to enjoy in terms of sending more transactions through 3D Secure. Then the likelihood of improving the authorization rate is increased.
Yeah, and I think some of the questions that come out of this type of discussion are around, what is 3D Secure mandated? Is 3D Secure required in the United States and North America like it is in other regions? Now, there's been a lot of news, and if you've heard of our other webinars, we've talked about PSD2, and you can think of that as a regional mandate to use 3D Secure. Well, why is there a regional mandate, for example, like in Europe? Well, the EBA came together and said, well, there must be a way that we can improve online transaction performance. And while 3D Secure isn't the only way to improve online transaction performance, it's a very efficient way to do so. And so in Europe, you're looking at a lot of additional 3D Secure adoption to meet that PSD2 mandate. It's not mandated today in the United States, and that's precisely why we're talking about the value. Here in the United States and where we're based in North America, there isn't a mandate that'll force you to use 3D Secure, and so that's why we spend a lot of time focusing why merchants ought to be using 3D
why
Secure.
Might you want to use it? And there's plenty of benefits, and also to set aside those concerns of the poor consumer experience from the past. That merchants, for example, in the U.S., where it's not mandated, should not really consider that as a viable concern going forward.
Yeah.
I think we had somebody else was asking about 3DS 2.0 and whether all issuers do they support that today? And really, the answer is no, but they will be.
That's right.
It's evolving and it's taken some time, but definitely the issuing, all the issuers are going to eventually migrate to 2.0. And that's already started, and we're noticing that the pace of that migration starting to increase.
Yeah, that's quickening. We've already processed millions of EMV 3DS or 3DS 2.0 transactions. Cardinal has, and every month the number's increasing dramatically. So we're expecting that to overtake the original 3D Secure in the coming months and years, for sure.
But important to note there, though, Nick, that merchants shouldn't necessarily wait to adopt 3DS 2.0 or 2.1, whatever the version might be. They potentially are leaving money on the table today, even if they adopt 3DS 1.0. There's benefit that they could be accruing, either in the form of authorization rate lift or fraud reduction.
Yeah, it's important to note you do not need EMV 3DS or the new version of 3D Secure in order to achieve these results. In fact, it wasn't available widely when these results were found. So we expect similar results with EMV 3DS. However, we'll expect an even better consumer experience to go along with those, incrementally better consumer experience. So EMV 3DS should be a win-win across both the experience and also these performance improvements.
Yeah, and I think one last point on that, important to stress that providers like Cardinal can route those transactions down the appropriate path, whether it's a 1.0 transaction today and it becomes a 2.1, 2.2 transaction tomorrow. We have a protocol routing mechanism so that automatically diverts the transaction accordingly. So from the merchant's perspective, all they need to do is integrate, and then we take care of the rest, right?
Yeah, it does sound like a chore when you think of all these different versions, but then we use protocol routing to get rid of that.
Yeah,
that's perfect.
Lovely phrase, protocol routing.
Well, I think we've done it, Paul. I think we've done it again. What do you say? I appreciate everybody's time and the questions you guys have submitted. If we've missed any questions, we'll follow up with the individuals.
Yeah, and it's important for listeners to feel free to send through other questions that we have not been able to address during this particular session, but we'll be happy to respond in writing afterwards. So thank you, Nick. Enjoyed the session again and look forward to our next session.
I can't wait to see what your next data set is going to look like, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you
and thanks, everyone. Have a good day.